podcast.
Conscious as.
What does it mean to be black?
The moment when I figured out that we were black, my family and I, it was in 1994. Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa.
I was a little bit past 12 years old that I realized I was actually black. That happened when I moved to Canada.
I knew I was black since day one.
Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Accomplice podcast. I'm your host, the Other Brother. In the shadows of the COVID-19 pandemic, we live in a world where, more than ever, we should be aware that we are all one people, one humanity. And yet, we are plagued with the effects of racism, systemic oppression, and injustice, which continue to marginalize people of color around the world. In North America, particularly in the United States, recent years have borne witness to a resurgence of anti-black racism and a disproportionate number of episodes of police brutality against African Americans. Groups like Black Lives Matter and others have attempted to bring awareness to these issues and to garner support from other communities in an effort to bring about a long overdue end to the violence, inhumanity, and ignorance that is being perpetuated. The idea that white individuals support and ally themselves with people of color in an effort to bring about change is not new. Abolitionists like John Brown or freedom riders like Andrew Goodman lost their lives in the pursuit of what they believed was their duty to help create fairness and equality in a society that was largely built by the labor of enslaved people. They were, in a sense, more than supporters, more than allies. They were what I would call accomplices. A supporter may passively believe in your cause, and an ally might cheer you on from the sideline, but an accomplice is committed. And an accomplice stands side by side with you and invests their effort and energy into your cause. So today, we launch the Accomplice podcast in the spirit of those who have gone before us and made sacrifices to uplift humanity. We will be relentless in this pursuit, and we will be unwavering. And we will be conscious as. So thanks for joining us, folks. Today we've got a great show, and the conversation today is about what does it mean to be black. Certainly that is something that I think a lot of folks are talking about these days, and there are many, many views and opinions on exactly what that looks like. And today the show is centered around four gentlemen of the African diaspora that I'll be talking to, each with their own unique story, their own unique background, and their own opinions and views on what it means to them to be a black man. My guest today, I will introduce now. Very thankful to each and every one of them for joining me. And we're going to get started. First is Mr. Richard Mwangi. Richard is in Toronto and around various courtrooms across Ontario. He has spent his career litigating for his clients, and he received an honors Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto and later attended Osgoode Hall Law School, where he took a keen interest in criminal law. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Next, I have Mr. Philip Wilkerson. Philip Wilkerson is, among many things, has his own podcast, and it is called The Positive Filter. He is also the husband to his wife of 10 years and father of 2 boys. Philip is a higher education professional, enjoys mentoring youth for careers beyond college. Philip, welcome to the show. Philip will be bringing perspective as our resident African American participant this morning in the conversation. Next up is my co-producer, the one and only Jay Harris. Jay, welcome on the show. Jay works diligently behind the scenes with me to help produce the shows. Jay is a social media manager and technology enthusiast. He is known as a creative thinker and problem solver, and grew up in the lovely island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. Jay, welcome.
It's great to be here for the inaugural show.
All right, all right. And last but not least, it's the one and only, the ambassador, Toronto's very own. This gentleman, as you can see, is our resident DJ. He was born and raised in the city of Toronto. His mom is from Antigua and his dad from St. Kitts. He is a 2007 graduate of the University of Toronto and works full-time in commercial mortgage lending as a senior commercial account manager. And he is also one of our brothers, as all these gentlemen actually are, members of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. But on this show, he is our resident DJ. He is the ambassador. Gents, thank you all so very much, and welcome. I'm going to now dive into our first question of the day, and I'm going to give each of you the opportunity to discuss this. And what I would like to start out with, this is a question I think that a lot of people who are going to be listening to this podcast, this is a really good place to start. And the bottom line is, for each of you, and I'm going to start actually with Richard. Richard, the question is, at what age did you first become aware of the concept of race, and incorporate that into that? At what point in your life did you understand that you were black, and what does being black mean to you? So I'll start with Richard.
Wow, how much time do we have? Very complex question there, but I'll break it up into just smaller parts that will be easier for me to answer. Starting back with for example, when did I find out that? Oh, I see you shaking your head, Alex. Everything okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead. It was breaking up a little bit, but go ahead.
Okay, no problem. So, what does it mean to be black for me? I'd say it was not until I was a little bit past 12 years old that I realized I was actually black. That happened when I moved to Canada and realized that everybody that was on the same shade skin that I was referred to as black. Grew up in Africa, in Kenya. I was born in Nairobi and grew up there all my life until I was 12 when my family and I moved to this country, Canada. And prior to that, yes, I was of dark shade. I was an African. Internally, I believed I was an African. I was Kenyan. And that was what was in my blood. I was different from the people that I saw on TV and on media, the white people. We call them the Europeans or the Americans. We were colonized by the Brits, so we were from a British system, and there was still some colonial people around, and we call them the Brits, the Europeans, and basically it was Europeans and the blacks. Unfortunately, just due to post-colonial mentality, we thought that they were always better than us because everything on TV seemed to be much better, and everything that they did when they were in our country seemed to be much better. They drove the nicer cars, they had the bigger houses, they had the nicer clothes, but much later came to understand that all that stuff had been taken from other people. But in short, it has been many years of developing and understanding better what it means to be black to me. And and it's still something that's ongoing even till today. And upon being Canadian African or African Canadian is also its own unique identity. And I've learned to understand it more as we go.
Right on. Rich, I'm gonna go to our next guest. I'm actually gonna jump over to Philip. Philip, you are from the United States, Virginia area. Tell us a little bit about your experience and your thoughts on this question.
Well, I like that I followed up because I think it was very interesting. Looking at that global perspective, I knew I was black since day one, in a sense that I grew up in America. just early exposure about race, going to school with different color, people of color. And so it was just always an understanding that I had darker skin, but I was also labeled as a black child. And just looking at my parents and their experiences, and also just TV, as you said, the media, just seeing on TV, that person's black, that person's white. So I think very early on, I mean, very consciously, I think even in preschool, I was in a very diverse preschool. I was we were black kids, they were white kids. So we kind of knew, in my mind, ingrained that my identity was attached to blackness very early on.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you for that, Philip. I would like to ask this question of you in the context of this particular part of the discussion, and that is, for folks who come up in the United States. The terms black and African American seem to be synonymous in a lot of cases. Not maybe for everyone. I know some people don't like one or the other in on an individual basis perhaps. But can you explain that a little bit? Again, you kind of mentioned from your perspective growing up in America, the how that plays out in terms of a person identifying as either black or African American or both.
Thank you so much. So this is a very complex question. And the reason why I say that is, yes, I'm of the African diaspora. I know where my people come from, but there is this very hard tie to say that, I feel completely African at certain points. I've been generationally removed from that experience. And in addition, to fully embrace American identity, I would say, like, when did America really feel like I was very included or inclusive, or many black people? But then I don't want to disrespect my father, who served 30 years in the Army to this country and dedicated himself to, I guess, America. But as I've gone on in life and been more reaffirmed in myself in adulthood, I, am more comfortable in myself with just calling myself black, and as a label of something I identify. But if someone say, hey, my African American friend, I don't get offended. It doesn't offend me. But just as a person of how I view myself over time, identity is very important to people. I think I've gotten more and more comfortable just saying black, which encompasses, I think, a lot of identities. Also, it pulls me in to Brother Richard's point that we are both black, we are both brothers. And so, even if I were to go to Africa, I feel like there would be some disconnect. Like I didn't grow up in the continent, and that kind of makes me upset a little bit that I feel like that part of my identity was robbed. But when I claim blackness, I feel like I get something back. I feel like I get a firm identity back. So to your question, the way I view myself, the way I navigate the world, I navigate the world as black. I'm a black man, and particularly a capital. I capitalize black. I don't know if that's someone's pet peeve or whatever, but it's more like, it's not just the color of skin. When it's lowercase, it's more of like a strong identity. So I capitalize black as I write it, or when I write it in things, or tweet about it, or type it up in books. I make a very strong point to capitalize black. So to your point, I view myself as a black man.
Right on. I'm going to go next to Jay Harris. Jay is from the island of St. Kitts. So Jay, talk to us a little bit about your experience growing up in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I remember distinctly the moment when I figured out that we were black, my family and I. It was in 1994. Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa. And I remember playing in the back of the house and hearing my mother and father shouting something was happening in the front of the house, and they called us down and sit us in front of the TV, and we watch. So I don't remember if it was the inauguration or it was just the moment when everyone realized that he had been elected. But we watched that on TV, and they sort of explained the concept motivation and why it was important for him to be president. And so that was the eye-opening moment for me. I think I was 8 years old at the time.
Right on. Okay, well, gents, thank you for that. I'm going to go to my main man, the ambassador. This brother, as we said, grew up in Toronto. He's our resident DJ, and it's almost time for your spot, man. So I'm going to, before we get into the song of the week, any thoughts on that, being a man from Toronto, East York in the house specifically? What are your thoughts, man?
So my thoughts in general are actually a bit of a mix of, I would say, Brother Jay and Brother Philip, in the sense that in Canada, similar to the U.S., individuals of African descent are a minority. So once you were born and raised here, you kind of learn from the jump that you are a black person, and the people around you will also acknowledge you as a black person as well as your own identity, right? So there's a certain attachment to being black. However, because the cultural context is different in terms of my background being from the Caribbean, there's still a heavy connection to the Caribbean heritage as well, and that understanding. So it's kind of like both identities take up a part, right? And as well as the Canadian identity, having lived and been born and raised here. So.
Right on. So it is time for the song of the week. Now, what we're going to do each and every episode, we're going to give you just a little taste of music from the African diaspora around the world. The ambassador is going to bring you a song each and every podcast, give you a little bit of background about the culture, where this music is from, a little history, and just open up your mind to the plethora of music from around the world and around the globe that he brings to us through his DJ platform. Pretty amazing guy. I've been working with him now for the last couple of years. We've done some online sets, and we'll be bringing more of those to you. But definitely appreciate having you as part of this show, man. And what do you have for us this week?
All right. So for the first song ever, Accomplice podcast. Let me drop this right now.
Now ain't it good to know that after so long, yes, we can all come together, share each other's views, yes. Now ain't it good to know?
All right, so that song right there is from the artist Barris Hammond, one of my favorite reggae artists. The title of the song is Ain't It Good to Know? The origin of the song is from Jamaica, and it's reggae music. So just a little small thing about reggae music. It originated in Jamaica. It evolved from some of the older genres of Jamaican music, such as mento, ska, and rocksteady. But it was also influenced by American soul and jazz music. So there was a connection between the regions from that standpoint. It is a genre that has spread throughout the world, but is especially popular in some sub-Saharan African nations, as well as throughout the Caribbean. Pretty much every island you go to, you can hear it. Often I find in the mainstream North American context, when people refer to reggae music, they refer to, the stereotypical kind of smoking marijuana and vacation type of thing. But reggae music, as I understand it, as I've grown up with it, is a form of music that was used to transfer uplifting messages as well as social and political commentary to the masses. So as you hear in this song, he talks about ain't it good to know. One of the first things he talks about is that we can sit together and share each other's views as we're doing on the podcast right now. Thanks.
Right on. Appreciate you, man. So you are listening to the Accomplice podcast. I'm your host, the other brother. That was our song of the week from Barris Hammond, courtesy of our resident DJ, the ambassador. We're talking about what it means to be black. My four guests, Richard Mwangi, Philip Wilkerson, Jay Harris, and of course, my main man, the ambassador. I want to go into a little more in depth into this discussion. And Jay, I'm going to start with you. what makes a person black? I think a lot of folks out here, this is a question that people have, again, many different answers and viewpoints about, because we see that, in today's world, especially in North America, you have a lot of people of, that are biracial, mixed race, etc. There's lots of different terminology that is used to describe people who are multiracial, all of this, and it can be sometimes complex to navigate. But in your view, what is it that makes a person black or identify as black? Your mic, brother.
Rookie mistakes all day long for me. Yeah, great question. I think it really comes down to culture. In the Caribbean, we have all sorts of shades and tones and skin colors, and we have lots of different names for those things. But I think in the end, we all sort of ride under the same banner, and it comes down to culture and whether or not you're familiar with the upbringing and sort of the sayings and the traditions of what we consider to be black culture. And like, even though we're separated geographically, Africa, the Caribbean, North America, will have similar things, some stuff still across those geographic boundaries. Food is kind of still the same. We all still love, there's the yams and the pumpkins and growing provisions and all that stuff. Right? It's all still the same. So I think it really comes down to the culture in the end.
Right on. I'm going to take it on over to Philip, because we're sort of touched on this already, but again, from the U.S. perspective, again, I think we can dissect this really deeply. I mean, when you think about things, going back historically, the period of enslavement in the United States, and you have things from state to state. There's different rules on what defines a person as being black. The cliche maybe being the one drop rule, for example. But again, it seems to me today that a lot of the issue surrounds the word identity. So can you speak to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to full disclaimer, right? I am one black male in Virginia, right? What I mean by that is that I am not the representative of a whole, and we know that the experience of blackness is not monolithic. You brought it up, brother Alex, very well, that different experiences, someone biracial, someone in this state. And so when I was thinking about that answer, I really tried to think, how would I say this succinctly from the experience of Philip Wilkerson, right? Is that I think blackness is directly tied to identity and experience. And when I say that, is that we, all as gentlemen that are black, have a shared, I guess, cultural experience, but also a same worldview experience. And that worldview experience is, in no shade, is a non-white experience, right? Like, it's like the world views it certain levels of access, certain levels of historical context that shapes what I believe is black. That shapes who I am as black. It goes all the way back to ancestry, or people before me, but also goes back, or not back, but goes up to the current experience of how I navigate the world. So I would say the experience is the main one. And regardless, in that non-monolithic, there's a lot of shared experiences that black people may have. And it could be someone that's very fair-skinned, very light-skinned black, to someone that's very dark-skinned. We know we have different layers within colorism and all that. But at the end of the day, there's some shared experience for someone that's very light-skinned and that's very dark. They have a shared experience as they navigate the world. And so that is going to be the way. Definitely do that disclaimer again. That is going to be the way that I define it. And the reason why I say that is, as I become more of my own and read, it's almost like I have this second awakening. Like, I'm learning more. I am learning more about my identities, how I define identity. So I read books, and I was like, wow, that's what W.E. Du Bois meant by that two-spirit concept. I'm starting to feel that the dual consciousness, And so that's going to be my very short answer. We probably could have a whole podcast, like an hour-long podcast on this topic, but that's going to be how I define it for me at this current moment. It might change too, how I define it. You might ask me a year from now, 5 years from now, it might be a little bit different. So at this current moment, that's how I feel.
Right on, Richard. Coming as a young man from Kenya, and you touched a little bit on this, in your opening responses, but was there, from your perspective, you did sort of allude to that there were the Brits, as you put it, and black folks, but was the identity that you grew up with as a child more so black, or was it Kenyan or African? What would be more so, like, from a semantical approach? What was your experience as a child growing up?
I'd say we never really would use the word, at least, again, following up from Brother Philip, this is a very personal perspective. I'm not representative of anyone or all the individuals who grew up in East Africa back in the time when I grew up in Kenya, but we never or hardly ever used the word black. Black was never used as a word, but we called ourselves Kenyan. We called ourselves African. We called ourselves East African. So I grew up as an African child. The white people at that time, as they were, we called them, I mean, they're mostly Europeans, but of course other North Americans. But the concept of being African, the concept of calling myself a Kenyan would have, sorry, just have a phone going off here. I'm going to courts indulgence. Anyways, sorry about that. Yeah, so what the concept would be, the experience of which I grew up in. Deep down, I then realized that what I grew up knowing to be African or knowing to be Kenyan was Black Kenyan, Black African. This is because, as I told you, there were other Europeans there who still remained, and there were second, third generations of other Europeans, and they were technically African. They were born there, and they were raised there, so they are as Kenyan as I was. However, they're white Kenyans, and I was a Black Kenyan. And of course, the identity of Black became more solidified as I came here to Toronto and understood the issues and the rawness of which we went, the issues, the rawness of the experience of which people were going through, being people of African descent, being people who were Black. Growing up in Kenya, I would say, although we did have the racial experiences, because most of the people you had around you looked like you, it was a different type of discrimination. It's a different type of experience you had growing up. You had the different cultures, different groups, different tribes, different socioeconomic level people. So race in itself, as in Blackness, being a Black African, was not forefront, was not there all the time, unless you're comparing it to something else, whether it was media or the people who lived in the highlands who were the white Africans. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think it's really important that we pause for just 1 second, and Philip's alluded to it as well as yourself. The guests that we have here on the show today are representing themselves as their own individual perspectives and views and experiences. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that and to emphasize it, because as Philip, I think, said, you're just one, Black man in Virginia. You don't speak for everybody in the United States, for example, or even in your town, right? This is your experience. This is your personal view and opinion and so forth being expressed. And I think that's really a great place for us to actually start as a foundation when we think of being an accomplice, and we think of the type of dialogue that we can have with folks that are maybe quote unquote different from us, is to understand that each person is their own individual self, comprised of their family upbringing, experiences, all these things, as a human being. And so in order to get to know and understand somebody from a different culture, we have to approach them as an individual human being, I believe, and understand who they are as a person, as an individual, and then how the culture and their environment and other things, other factors, the same factors that influence all of us in various ways, how those things influence and shape that individual person. So I really appreciate the candor and the depth to which we're discussing, your experiences as individual men. Right now, it's time. We're going to take it back to the ambassador, our song of the week from Beres Hammond. We'll be right back with more of the Accomplice podcast.
Let's just all be nice. All is united and you are invited to share this paradise. Yeah,
All right. That's our song of the week from Beres Hammond. You'll hear a little bit more from the ambassador a little bit later in the show, but right now, getting back to my guests, this is the Accomplice podcast. We're talking about what does it mean to be black from the perspective of these four gentlemen that I have joining me here today. So, Philip, I'm gonna kick this off with yourself. Actually, sorry, I'm going to kick this off with Richard. The next question is actually, we want to talk a little bit about the difference in experience of folks who have immigrated, or maybe your parents immigrated to the United States or Canada, to North America from somewhere else, versus the African American experience. So I'm going to start with Richard again, talking a little bit about, the in your perspective, what are some of the key differences as being somebody who immigrated from another country to North America, in terms of the black experience, and maybe in the context of how do you see when we hear the term the black community, and you just spoke about your own self growing up in Kenya and having that cultural identity that you came with. How did that change, or how was that influenced by coming to North America and having an experience here?
So moving to North America, the experience was quite enlightening. Initially, when I first came as a kid, I did not fit in with the white kids. I did not fit in with the other Asian or kids from all over the globe. And the people I mostly resembled were the people who were dark skinned, like I was. They were the kids from the Caribbean, kids from the States, and they call themselves. I now would say they were black kids, and I would consider myself black, yes. But at that time, the kids that I hanged around with from the Caribbean, mostly from Jamaica, would call me the African youth. I was the African youth for a long time. It's a nickname that stuck on, probably then converted into Kenya boy, the Kenya boy, and I've been called the Kenya boy even until today by some of my middle school and high school friends. And I noticed that the Caribbean kids called me the same name as the white kids. They called me the African boy. But I never took too much offense from the Caribbean kids calling me that. However, I did take offense from other people calling me that. But the experience was quite enlightening. There was a stark difference between the Africans that had immigrated from Africa, as in the first generation Africans, versus people who had been here for years, even people who were actually of African heritage or African background. What I did note, though, was that no matter the amount of generations in Canada, at least in Toronto, there was a very heavy love for people's backgrounds. There was a very heavy, um, I lose words for it, but there was a large tie to people's backgrounds. So even a lot of these children or kids that I grew up with who call themselves Jamaican or a small island folk or Trinidadians or Nevis and Saint Kitts, and so on, called themselves those names, although they actually were born here in Canada. So you would ask someone, where are you from? And if they're not saying I'm from East York, Scarborough, North York, or the West End, they're saying, oh, I'm from Kenya or I'm from Jamaica. But meanwhile, it's either parents or grandparents that are from there. So I noticed that as a collective Black community here, there was a large tie and a large pride. There was a lot of pride of where people's parents originally were from in the community here in Toronto, and I see it even today. And I enjoy it, love it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think even for myself as a person of a European background, you know, and spending time as a kid, especially between Canada and the U.S., going back and forth, it was always in Canada. I felt like it was acceptable to have your cultural identity. So if you're from, you know, France or you're from Scotland or you're from Ireland, whatever, that was fine. You could still be a Canadian and be, you know, identify with your cultural background, your parents or grandparents' heritage, and yet and that didn't infringe on your being Canadian, so to speak. But in the States, it was very different. It was, you know, very much an amalgamous thing where, you know, people kind of put that behind them and generationally and are seen as this whole one amalgamous group of white folks, more so. That always seemed to me in that sense. Claude, I want to turn to you, the ambassador, and you know, talk about, as Richard had mentioned, you know, being one of those young men who grew up in Toronto, but yet your folks are from the Caribbean. As I mentioned in the intro, your mom's from Antigua, your dad's from St. Kitts, and of course you. In the time I've gotten to know you, that heritage and that cultural appreciation is very strong and very much a part of your whole life experience.
Absolutely. So again, what Rich was saying was pretty much bang on in terms of the identifying. So when my parents came over from the Caribbean, obviously they were the first generation. They were immigrants here, and they had to deal with, you know, stereotypes about where they came from. Obviously, there's just like anywhere else, where if you're not educated about where these people are from, sometimes you end up dealing with people who are ignorant and so on and so forth, and just kind of the typecasting of what the Caribbean was and everything like that. So one of the things that, on top of course, my mother and father having their own like family pride and identity pride and everything like that, and in loving their culture, they wanted to instill that in their children. But then you also understood that, well, there was an experience outside of the house, which was people don't really understand or don't really know sometimes what what your heritage is about. And they look to media. So like we're talking about with the reggae, where, you know, it's typecast a certain way or stereotyped as a certain thing, but it's like, yeah, that's there, but that's not all there is. There's a lot more to it. So what ended up happening was that, you know, and just growing up and everything like that, you identify with your Canadian experience living here and everything like that. But Canada to you was hockey. They don't have hockey in the Caribbean yet, as far as I know. Polar bears. I know they don't have those in the islands and stuff like that, versus what your parents are making at home, the music that they're listening to at home, those type of things, and just the different experiences you'd have. And what I found similar to what Richard was talking about was like seeing it from the other side, where when you would run into Caribbean people or people from thing who were born and raised in the islands or on the continent, they didn't get it. Some of them, some did, some didn't when you explained it, because to them they're like, you're born here, you grew up here, this is what you are. And we're like, no, no. In Canada, when you're a child of an immigrant, you're not just Canadian. You still link back to your heritage, and that is still reinforced in you. So that's why, going back to even the previous question about the identity as black. It's like black and Caribbean. They work together with me. Then one is not over the other, and they don't discount the other. It's not like I'm Caribbean, so I'm not black. No, they work together in tandem for me. So
Right on. So speaking of the Caribbean, Jay, I'm going to come to you because you have had the experience growing up in St. Kitts and then attending university in the U.S. and then now living in Canada. What has the transition? What are some of the key differences that you've experienced as an adult who's emigrated from the Caribbean to North America in terms of again this dialogue about black community and that experience? What are some of the key differences you see from where you grew up?
Well, I guess the one difference being the temperature, right? When you get up here, it's way more than it is in the islands. But I'm just messing around. Yeah, I go for it. Oh yeah, yeah. So I'm thinking that I from my perspective, I see a lot of similar things, and that's because you can find your culture wherever you go. And so it's like Claude was saying, like Caribbean people aren't afraid of being Caribbean wherever they go. So whether it was when I was in South Florida, you'd always be able to find sort of like the Jamaican contingency. Well, if you go to New York, it's the same thing. You go to Houston, wherever you are, you go to Toronto, you can find the Trinis, you can find the Guyanese crowd, and you can make yourself comfortable and accustomed. And those people are really outgoing, and so that type of culture eventually permeates throughout the environment that you're in. And so I think to Richard's point, maybe earlier on you don't have a bunch of those people around, but over time, so like when I finally get to Toronto, there's Caribbean folk everywhere, and so I feel at home. And even if you're not with a Caribbean person, they've experienced Caribbean culture through someone else because there's so many of us, and you feel at home no matter where you go.
So, Philip, I want to turn to you now again from an American perspective, and the thing that I want to point out to our listeners, to our viewers, is that there's a very different experience from my perspective in listening to all of you, all my guests, and I think this is something across the board that we need to really look at. As we explore the idea of being an accomplice, because there is not a one size fits all definition or identity when it comes to being black and being a person of the African diaspora. We're hearing all these different perspectives and unique experiences. And I think it's really important. One of the key things, though, that stands out to me is, as I listen to Richard, I listen to Jay, I listen to Claude, the ambassador here, there is a strong cultural and heritage identity that they bring with them, whether it was from their own personal experience growing up in another country or through their family. We know that the history of African Americans, of people, black people in the United States, from the time of slavery to current, is very different. And even though there is, obviously in the Caribbean, there is a similar period of enslavement there, the cultural identity, I think, at least it seems to me, is different. So, and I think it has to do a lot with the fact of course, just the trauma of the slave trade and people being enslaved and disconnected from their families, from their culture, from their language, all of those things that we kind of make us human, really, in our identity, and to have to sort of recreate that in this new context in the U.S. and especially in the early onsets of colonization there, and that has effects still today, I think. What is your opinion on that, and how do you see sort of the difference when you listen to like Richard or Jay, for example, talk about their experience? How is that different for somebody who's African American?
So I was thinking, I love that you got me in the flow of this because I get to listen and nod my head, and I'll be totally transparent. I get a little salty, a little jealous. I just recently did my ancestry, the DNA test, and it was saying what countries I'm from. They said, I got a little bit of European. It told me I'm Scottish or whatever. But then they said I also have Cameroon and a lot of the Gold Coast, right? Duh, like, come on, let's be historical, right? Like, duh, that makes sense, right? But then I'm not rushing to the store and get me a shirt, for the Cameroon. And when they play in the World Cup, I'm putting on a Cameroon shirt. Like I don't have that identity tied to that percentage of my DNA or ancestry. And so I think, human beings want to find places to belong. So we find other groupings, right? I say I'm a Virginian, right? We got that regional tie. Like, I'm not just an American, I'm Virginian. I'm from the South. We got a little different vibe than the Midwest, brothers. We got a little different vibe than our New York brothers. And we were just talking about it the other day, even to music, right? Like, I got in arguments. People were trying to New York rap is the best. I was like, man, you can't discredit the South, man. We brought it with Outkast and all that. So with that sense is that, right, like geographically we want to be tied to a community, right? And so and has ancestry and a history and just the cultural background, which I think a lot of African Americans, blacks, feel disconnected from. I remember growing up in high school, my first exposure to different black people was high school, right? When I grew up in elementary school, it was just black, white. I get to Mount Vernon, shout out to Mount Vernon High School, and we literally had, kids from Ghana. We had kids from Ghana, Nigeria, and I can't think of another African country, but we would, in my ignorance, we just lumped them together. Those are the African kids, right? Those dudes from Africa. As I've gotten more, I'm like, well, no, there's a really cultural tie. Those are Ghanaian, they're from Ghana. They're Ghanaian. Those are Nigerians. And if you meet those African brothers, they got a strong tie. Like, no, we're Nigerian, we're Ghanaian. They rock with them. And my best friend, my brother, the godfather of my godchildren, he's Jamaican. That's a strong tie right there. Like, you can't tell him he's not Jamaican. And he was born in Jamaica, immigrated here, but he even in second grade on in America, he is Jamaican. You cannot tell him otherwise. And that is an experience that I don't think a lot of black people in America have. And going back to that, it does make me sad sometimes. It makes me, like, that would be cool. Or it makes me, honestly, I'm going to go visit Africa. I've been a couple of times to other countries, I've been in Egypt and all that, but I want to go directly to the countries that were on my ancestry.com. I want to go to the land where some of my DNA is from, and just be there and vibe there. So I don't know. I think if we ask a lot of black people, maybe they have a totally disconnection. I think maybe it might be a protective measure to just lump people like as other, like, because if you really realize it, if you really think about that, it is traumatic. Like, if I really think about that, I don't know exactly who maybe 5 generations are from, then it makes me realize I have to face the reality of a cross-continental trauma that someone in my lineage experienced. Like, I would have to address that mentally. So it'd probably be easier in regards to discounting trauma as saying, I'm just American, or I'm just Virginian, and I don't have this real tie to Africa. And it's almost a second awakening when you read and learn more. So I'm glad I took that DNA test. I know someone, if you want to do a GoFundMe and give me some money, I'm just joking. But I'm going to go to Africa. I'm going to find a way to go there, experience the country, really go back and really get in roots to the intricacies of my blackness, which is not just a lump, the continent of Africa. I want to go to the nations and see what nations really have a connection to me. So that's just kind of my thoughts right now. As I said earlier, maybe you hit me in a year, maybe you hit me after I go to these African countries, and maybe I'll have a different perspective when I really get to learn more about myself and where I came from.
You're listening to the Accomplice podcast, and time for our last little musical interlude here with the Ambassador and Barris Hammond.
Now, together and share each other's views. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wouldn't it be good to know that some old time enemies, yes, cease fire and let the beauty start to show. Then no shot, no bus, and then no one no fuss, oh, and then no fire, no burn, oh, and no blood, no run. Then no shot, no bus, oh, and then no one no curse, and then no fire, no burn, oh, and no blood, no run.
You're listening to the Accomplice podcast. I am your host, the other brother. And coming down to the wire here, the last segment of our show before we wrap up here. And this is sort of our rapid fire segment. I'm going to give each of my guests 30 seconds or so to ask a question, and they're going to give us their take on this final question in short form as we round out the last segment. So we've talked a lot today about identity, how people identify as Black, what their thoughts are behind the nuances of being Black, being a person who has immigrated to North America from another country, who's grown up in North America, the United States, etc. And more recently, there has been sort of a phenomenon, I guess you might call it, of folks who are identifying as another race. Particularly, I think of an individual like a Rachel Dolezal, the former NAACP president in Washington State, Spokane, Washington, who has, quote unquote, identified herself as trans Black. That's a whole topic probably for another episode, but in 30 seconds or less, I'm going to ask each of my guests. I'm going to start with Richard. I want to know the answer to this question. In 30 seconds or less, can someone who is not of the African diaspora identify as Black? Why or why not? Richard, you're up.
I don't think they could identify as Black. They could identify with partial experience of what they have seen. It's very difficult, I would say, again, this is my personal perspective, very difficult and practically impossible for you to identify as something you've never experienced. So as much as you would like to, because you've never seen life through that person's eyes, you've never been in their skin, you've never been in their feet, it's very difficult to. You could sympathize with, you could understand many aspects of it. However, I would respectfully submit, no, it's not possible.
Jay, I'm going to come to you next. Is this a thing, or what's your take, man?
I think most of human identity is learned, and if someone was in a position where from a really early age they were able to learn Black identity, even if they weren't Black, I'd be fine with that person saying that they were Black. Like, for instance, if you were adopted, or if you happen to grow up in a majority Black environment.
Right on. Philip, your thoughts?
I liked both answers. I'm gonna play like the Switzerland in both. And like maybe later on in life, and you just wake up one day and say I'm Black. Maybe not so. Also look at the complexities of their experience. How early on those early experiences of maybe, as I was thinking of that movie with Steve Martin where he grew up in an all Black family and he thought he was Black until they told him he wasn't. So it's a very complex thing. But also, I would also say, the last point, wrap it up in 30 seconds. Now, for them claiming that they're Black, and are they claiming that they're Black in a sense for elevating themselves, or kind of, you know what I meant, like promotional material, or are they doing it in a sense of shared community feeling? So I'd be really weary to the intent of someone claiming such transracial identity.
Right on. Finally, I'm going to come to my main man, the ambassador, as we wrap this up, brother. It's been a deep show, man. This inaugural episode.
True. So just in 30 seconds or less, just in the discussion that we've had, it's pretty obvious that race is a social construct, mainly in the society that you're in. So, say for example, I've been to Australia. I've met some Aboriginals from Australia. They identify as black, not necessarily of African ancestry. However, the society also recognizes them that way. So if you're in a society that recognizes you as black and you also identify as black, then I get it. But for you to, and similar to what Brother Philip was saying, for you to just pick up in your 25 and 30 and say, I'm black now, when there's been no kind of social construct to do that, other than you just saying that you're black, then I can't accept you as that.
Well, gentlemen, that's all the time we're going to have for this particular episode. I want to thank my guests, Richard Mwangi, Jay Harris, Philip Wilkerson, and of course my main man, the ambassador, for joining me here today. We shared their social media information if you'd like to follow them or get in contact with them for more information about what they're doing. And of course, the ambassador be right back here with me on our next episode of the Accomplice podcast. I am your host, the other brother. Again, it's been a great discussion, a great kickoff to the Accomplice podcast, and we thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.